Hi, my name's Chaz, and you're watching Chaz's Languages. In this video, I'll be reviewing the books that I use to learn Finnish. Hi you guys, thank you for watching. Today I'll be talking about and reviewing the books that I used when I studied Finnish. So I studied Finnish for 3.5 years from 2014 until 2018 with books and other resources, and I was able to reach a lower advanced level. And after I stopped actively studying it, I began passively studying it, where I started reading books, reading newspapers, watching TV shows, listening to music. So that's a little background on my history with Finnish. So the first book I used was Beginner's Finnish. I bought it on Amazon. So here's the book, Beginner's Finnish, and the author is Agi Risko. Let's go ahead and dive into the book. So first off, the book at the beginning of it has a pronunciation guide for the language and the rules for consonant gradation in Finnish, as well as other language tips and a little background on the language. So it's nice that it has that for you to kind of get you started with the language. Although it would be nice if it would explain those things more in the chapters, but it doesn't do that. And so this is how each chapter is set up. First, at the beginning of each chapter, there's a dialogue that you read, and it has an English translation of the dialogue on the other side. And that's nice for beginners who are starting out because it shows you what you're reading. If you get confused or you don't understand the Finnish, then you can look at the English translation, and then you won't be as lost. And then after that, vocabulary that's used in the chapter that's been introduced is listed out and defined from Finnish to English. And then the next section in the chapter is the useful expressions page. And those are expressions that were used in the chapter, and they're phrases that can't be directly translated, or they're just useful for conversation, things like that. And then the next section in the chapter is the exercises section. And that's where you can do exercises so you can practice the vocabulary and grammar that you learned in the chapter. So those are really helpful because they really help to instill what you just learned from the chapter in your mind. And then at the end of the book, it has an answer key where you can check all your answers to the exercises that you do for each chapter. And then there's also an English to Finnish and a Finnish to English dictionary that defines all the words that were used in the book. So that's really useful if you want to look up a word that you remember from a chapter, but you don't remember the English translation, or vice versa. If you don't remember the Finnish translation of an English word that you knew you learned, then you can just look it up in the back of the book. So some of the pros for the book: it's a very good start for beginners. The chapters are not too long, so you can get through them fairly easily and quickly, as long as you study and really look at the grammar, study it, and study the vocabulary. And also all the chapters have a really nice, good layout. It's very easy to read and it's very pleasing to the eyes. And then lastly, I think that the vocabulary exposure is very good. It exposes you to a lot of good and useful vocabulary and not a bunch of useless words or words that you would hardly ever use. It seems to only introduce words that are very good for conversation, especially for a beginner's level of Finnish. Now, some cons of the book are, firstly, and this is the biggest thing I noticed in the book, is that some of the grammar explanations are not in depth enough for the language. Finnish is a very grammar-heavy language, and you really have to know the grammar to be able to speak it properly. And I noticed that some of the grammar points just aren't explained well enough, and they are kind of vague, where the book basically says, here's a basic overview of this grammar point, but we're not going to explain it in depth, which I don't think is very helpful, especially for beginners. And then the second con I noticed is the English translations that are in each chapter. I personally think that they could be good at the very beginning, but I think once you get out the first few chapters, they could actually hinder learning, and they can become kind of a crutch because you get too used to looking at them instead of actually reading the Finnish and learning what everything means by working it out based on context clues. So that's why I don't really like the English translations as far as later on in the book. At the very beginning, it's very good to have those, but I think once you get past like the first 3 or 4 chapters, I would suggest not looking at those because those can become just like a crutch and hinder your learning. And now let's move on to the next book. So the next book I used whenever I was studying Finnish was Teach Yourself Finnish, and I actually started using it when I was about halfway done with Beginner's Finnish, and I kind of used them alongside each other after that because they were very similar books and they complemented each other very well on the grammar and some of the vocabulary. So I started using it, as I said, about halfway through whenever I was using the Beginner's Finnish book. And so here's the book, Teach Yourself Complete Finnish, and the author is Tertulliani. I bought this book on Amazon about the same time as I bought Beginner's Finnish, but I decided to start with Beginner's Finnish because it looked like a good starting book. And then about halfway through using that book, I realized that I needed kind of another book to substitute it because I felt like I wasn't getting enough vocabulary and enough grammar explanations. And so I found this to be a very good complement to that book. So at the beginning of this book, like the Beginner's Finnish book I talked about earlier, it also has a pronunciation guide, guide to consonant gradation Finnish, and some other language tips and advice, as well as a little cultural history and a little language history of Finnish. So it's nice it has those little tidbits to kind of get you started in the language. And then at the end of this book, it also has an answer key and then a dictionary for all the terms that were used in the book, defined from Finnish to English, and then also English to Finnish. So again, if you have a word that you remember, you only remember one translation of it, then you can look it up and then you'll know, oh, okay, this is the meaning of it. So it's really helpful to have that built-in dictionary to the book that has just the vocabulary that's used in the book instead of searching through a dictionary that's huge or going online and having to search on Google. You just have it right there in the book. So that's really handy to have that. And the way that the chapters in this book are set up is that usually there are two dialogues. I think maybe some chapters just have one dialogue or one thing to read, but most chapters have two dialogues or two stories to read. And then after that, it has a section where it has cultural insights and tips that are related to the chapter and the chapter's topic and its vocabulary. And then the next section in the chapter is the grammar section, where it explains all the grammar that you learned in the chapter or that was used in the chapter. And I find that this book explains grammar very well, a lot better than the Beginner's Finnish book. So I really liked the grammar explanations that this book gives. And then after the grammar section is an exercises section, where it has different kind of exercises. The thing I like about this book that the Beginner's Finnish book didn't have is that there are listening exercises where you actually can listen to dialogues and you either answer questions about them or you write something about the dialogue. So I really like that about this book because it helps you to practice your listening, which is a very important language skill, especially in Finnish, to really nail down that listening and understanding of the language. And then after the exercises section, each chapter usually has a last dialogue that you read, and it kind of builds on the grammar and the vocabulary that you learned in the chapter even a little bit more, and also introduces some new vocabulary. And it's just nice to have that last little bit of reinforcement where you can read it and just practice the grammar and the reading and the vocabulary one more time before you move on to the next chapter. And then at the end of each chapter, there's a 10 things to remember section. And it's just 10 different things. They're usually phrases or sentences. And the point is not to get you to memorize those phrases, but for example, a chapter will say, I want coffee, and it'll have the Finnish translation. And what the book is wanting you to do is be able to know that you can make those kind of phrases and sentences. So if it says 10 things to remember, it wants you to be able to make those 10 different sentences. And it doesn't mean you have to make them exactly in that same way and you can only say those things. It wants you to be able to mix in your own words and your own verbs and make the sentence your own, but still be able to make a sentence or phrase of that type. So some pros about this book: I find that it was very, very good for beginners. It's a very good beginner's book. I'd say even more so than the Beginner's Finnish book because it starts out very simple. And like I said, it has very good grammar explanations and it takes you as far as you want to go up to a lower intermediate level. So I find that very good about this book. And then also I found that the book progresses very smoothly and not too fast, not too slow, so you don't find yourself getting lost in the book and wondering what's going on and not understanding everything. I think it takes you very nicely and smoothly through the Finnish language. And then as I said earlier, I think the grammar explanations in this book are great. They're amazing. It really breaks them down. And it has 18 chapters, which is 5 more than the Beginner's Finnish books, and maybe that's why it explains the grammar more. But I find that it really explains the grammar points down to the little nitty-gritty so that you can really learn them and get them in your brain. And then also another pro is that I think the vocabulary in this book is really great, just like the Beginner's Finnish book. This book has really great vocabulary. It's very relevant, very useful, very good for conversations. Also for light reading or things like that, I think this book really helps you to get to a good conversational level just because the vocabulary in it is very good. And it also introduces you to some colloquial Finnish, so you can also start learning natural Finnish and how to speak with people in Finnish and sound more natural when you speak, whereas the beginner's Finnish only use the written language form. So that's one thing I also like about this book. The only con that I found about this book is that each chapter has a lot of vocabulary. Some chapters can have over 100 words. And so depending on the type of person you are, you may not want to learn that much. But some chapters you need to learn at least, let's say, for example, 50 or 60 words to be able to move on to the next chapter. And if you're not that type of person, then the amount of vocabulary in each chapter might be a little daunting to you and might be a little bit difficult. So that's really the only thing that I found, is that there's a lot of vocabulary to learn, and that could be too much for some people. And then the last book that I used for Finnish is Finnish for Foreigners 2. I bought this book on eBay with a bundle with the exercise book that comes along with it. Now this book is an older book. I think it was first published in the 70s and then revised again in the 80s. So the vocabulary might be a little bit outdated at some times, but overall I think the book is very good, and most of the vocabulary is still very relevant and useful vocabulary. So here's the book, Finnish for Foreigners 2, and the author is Maija Helikki-Aaltio. And then here is the exercise book that I bought along with it, and it has all the exercises so that you can practice the grammar from each chapter. So I think this book is very suitable and very good if you're already at a lower intermediate or a higher elementary level. So if you've already reached the A2 level, and maybe you've already started into the B1 level, or if you're still in the A2 level, but you've already really learned most of the basic vocabulary and grammar for the language, then I would definitely recommend moving on to this book. But if you haven't, then I would not get into this book yet, because it would be a little bit daunting, and there's a lot of grammar that you would miss if you didn't already use a book that explained the elementary level grammar and vocabulary. There is a book that goes with it that is called Finnish for Foreigners 1, and it's actually the first part of this book series. And I would recommend, if you do want to study with this book, then you should probably start with that book, just because they go along together, and then you'll know that the same vocabulary is used across both books, and you'll already be used to the chapter structures and how the grammar and vocabulary is introduced. But since I didn't use that book, I'm not going to review that one, and I maybe will do a review of it later on, because I do actually own it. I just want to look over it and see how it is. It's very similar to this book, but again, I may review that one later on if you guys want to learn more about that book. So the way that this book is set up is that each chapter has first at the beginning of it either an article or a dialogue or a story to read, and the vocabulary isn't defined until after that. So you may want to first learn the vocabulary of the chapter before you read it. Otherwise, it could be kind of difficult, because there could be 30 or 40 words in the vocabulary list that you haven't learned yet. That would make it very difficult to understand that article or story or dialogue, whatever you're reading. And then after that, each chapter has a grammar section where it explains all the grammar in detail that was used in the article or story that you read. And I find that this book also, like the Teach Yourself Finnish, has very, very good grammar explanations. It's laid out very well. And since this book gets very in-depth and goes into the more intermediate and even advanced level Finnish, I think that for that it explains the grammar at those levels very well, because you really get into some more advanced level grammar Finnish that would be really difficult if the book didn't explain them well. So I think it does a good job at that. And then after that, at the end of each chapter, it has the vocabulary list, as I said earlier, of all the words that were used in the chapter. And the nice thing about this book is, since in Finnish words are declined and they have different endings depending how they're used on the sentence, I like how this book has the two most basic universal endings in Finnish that are put onto words. So it not only has the base word, but it also shows how the word would be if you put it, for example, in the genitive or partitive, which are a couple of word endings in Finnish. Well, I will talk about in a future video. And then now for the exercise book that goes along with it. I personally really like the exercises that are in this book. I think that they're very in-depth, and there are several of them, so you can really practice the language and practice the grammar that you learned and the vocabulary that you learned, and really enforce that and instill that in your mind. And then after the exercises, each chapter in the exercises book has a reader section. Now, I personally found the readers fairly difficult, especially later on in the book, just because the grammar structures and the vocabulary got very difficult later on in this. So as you move on, there will be several words that will be unfamiliar. And what I would do is maybe take a sticky note or something and look up the words that you don't know from the readers, and then write them down, and then define them, and then leave the sticky note in that page. So anytime you go back and read that reader, then those words will be there and you won't have to look them up every time, because a lot of the words that are in the readers aren't actually defined, or you don't actually learn them in the book. So it's very useful to have those already defined so you don't spend all that time every time you read them searching for them and defining them. So some pros of this book: I think it's very good for learners who are already at a lower intermediate level and who want to reach an advanced level. I think it's very good and very suitable for learners at that level. And then also I think that the vocabulary that the book teaches is very good. It's very in-depth, and it really gets you to a good conversational level, and even above that to an advanced level where you can start to read newspapers and books and really start to enjoy and use the language. So that's one thing also I really like about the book. And then the only con I noticed, which I actually mentioned earlier, is that the reading exercises in the exercise book and then the stories and articles and dialogues in the regular book get quite difficult as you move on, especially in the later chapters. So that would be the only thing, is that sometimes you might end up spending a lot of time on reading those just because they get so difficult and the grammar or the sentence structures get hard to understand. But I would say that also just depends on what type of person you are and if you want to get to that high level. If you don't want to, then you don't have to go through the whole book, then that wouldn't be a problem for you. But if you really want to go through the whole book and really reach a solid advanced level, then you will notice that the readers and the dialogues and the stories and articles do get quite difficult later on in the book. Well, that's it for the review of the books that I used whenever I studied Finnish. I hope that you guys enjoyed it, and I hope that it was helpful and very informative, and hopefully it'll help you guys to choose the right books whenever you choose to start studying Finnish. So don't you guys forget to like the Facebook page and follow the Twitter page for notifications, updates about the channel, things like that, and also more helpful hints and tips and language learning advice. And then don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this, as well as language learning videos. I'll be posting more videos teaching Finnish, so be sure to subscribe to keep up to date on all that. So again, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.